The feds announced they arrested the site's founder, 29-year-old Ross Ulbricht.
Ross Ulbricht has been found guilty of creating and running the Silk Road drug dealing website.
Before he became one of the most controversial figures in internet history, Ross Ulbricht was simply a quiet student from Austin, Texas. Friends described him as thoughtful, intelligent, and deeply curious about the world. He excelled academically and pursued a traditional path in science, studying physics at the University of Texas at Dallas before continuing his graduate studies in materials science at Pennsylvania State University. On the surface, Ross seemed destined for a normal career in research or technology. But outside the classroom, something else was shaping his worldview. Ross had become fascinated with political philosophy and economics, particularly a school of thought known as Austrian School of Economics. The Austrian School promotes the idea that markets function best when individuals are free to exchange goods and services without government interference. Two of the most influential thinkers in this tradition were Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Mises argued that economic systems should be based on voluntary cooperation between individuals rather than central planning. Hayek expanded on this idea, warning that excessive government control over markets could slowly erode personal freedom. To Ross, these weren't just abstract theories. They were a blueprint for a different kind of society. He spent hours reading libertarian blogs, economic forums, and philosophical discussions about free markets and individual liberty. In his personal writings, Ross often spoke about the importance of creating systems where people could interact freely without what he saw as unnecessary government restrictions. He believed that technology, especially the internet, could create new forms of economic freedom that had never existed before. But the early 2010s were also a time when new technologies were beginning to emerge. One of them was a decentralized digital currency known as Bitcoin, which allowed people to transfer money without banks. Another was Tor browser, a privacy-focused network designed to hide a user's identity online. To most people, these technologies were just experimental tools used by a small group of programmers and privacy advocates. But Ross Ulbricht saw something much bigger. He began to imagine a radical experiment. What if it were possible to build a marketplace where people could trade freely, without governments, without banks, and without identity? A place where the principles of Austrian economics, voluntary exchange, decentralized systems, and individual freedom could exist in their purest form. Within a few years, Ross Ulbricht would attempt to turn that idea into reality. And the result would become one of the most infamous marketplaces the internet had ever seen. By the late 2000s, the internet was beginning to change. New technologies were emerging that promised something radical: true online anonymity. One of those technologies was Tor. Originally developed with support from the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, Tor allowed internet traffic to be routed through a network of encrypted nodes around the world. Each layer of encryption worked like the layers of an onion, hiding the identity and location of the user. For journalists, activists, and privacy advocates, Tor became a powerful tool for protecting free speech. But it also created something new: a hidden layer of the internet, often called the dark web, where websites could exist anonymously. Around the same time, another revolutionary technology appeared. In 2009, an unknown developer using the name Satoshi Nakamoto released the first decentralized digital currency, Bitcoin. Bitcoin allowed people to send money directly to one another without banks or governments acting as intermediaries. Transactions were recorded on a public ledger called the blockchain, but the identities of users remained pseudonymous. To most people, Tor and Bitcoin were separate experiments. But Ross Ulbricht saw something that others didn't. If Tor could hide identities, and Bitcoin could move money outside traditional financial systems, then together, they could power something unprecedented: a global marketplace where buyers and sellers could interact without revealing who they were. No banks, no regulators, no central authority. To Ross, it wasn't just a technological experiment. It was the practical realization of the ideas he admired in Austrian economics: a free market built entirely on voluntary exchange, a digital economy beyond the reach of governments. In 2011, Ross Ulbricht decided to try building that system himself. He began coding a website that would soon become the most infamous marketplace on the internet. Ross Ulbricht didn't have investors. He didn't have a company, and he certainly didn't have a business plan. What he had was an idea, one that blended technology, philosophy, and a belief in radical economic freedom. In early 2011, Ross began quietly working on a website that would turn that idea into reality. Late at night, inside a small apartment, he started writing the code for what he believed could become the first truly anonymous marketplace. The website would only be accessible through the Tor, hiding both the server location and the identity of its users. Payments would be handled exclusively through Bitcoin, allowing buyers and sellers to exchange money without banks or financial institutions. Ross named the project Silk Road, inspired by the ancient trade routes that once connected Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Just like the historical Silk Road allowed merchants to trade across vast distances, Ross imagined a digital version of that system, one that existed entirely on the internet. At first, the marketplace was small. In fact, during the early days, Ross struggled to attract even a handful of users. To get things started, he reportedly created some of the first product listings himself. Slowly, a few vendors began appearing, then a few more. Within months, the marketplace began to grow. Silk Road was designed with features that made it feel surprisingly familiar, almost like a normal e-commerce website. Vendors could list products, buyers could leave reviews, and transactions were protected through an escrow system where payments were temporarily held until the buyer confirmed delivery. It worked a bit like eBay, but operating entirely in the shadows. Ross managed the entire platform under a pseudonym. On the forums, he called himself Dread Pirate Roberts, a name taken from the cult film The Princess Bride. Behind that alias, Ross acted as the administrator, moderator, and architect of the entire marketplace. He answered questions, resolved disputes between buyers and vendors, and constantly improved the platform's security. But Silk Road also had rules. Certain items were strictly forbidden, things like stolen credit cards, weapons, and child exploitation. Ross believed that the marketplace should operate according to a kind of libertarian code. Yet despite those rules, the majority of products sold on Silk Road were illegal drugs. And as word spread across internet forums and underground communities, the marketplace began to attract thousands of users from around the world. What started as a small experiment in anonymous trade was quickly turning into something much bigger. Within 2 years, Silk Road would become one of the largest black markets ever created online. And the man behind it was still just one person, typing quietly behind a laptop. What began as a small experiment on the hidden corners of the internet was now evolving into something far more ambitious. As the months passed, Silk Road's reputation spread rapidly through online forums, underground communities, and privacy-focused networks. Users who had never met one another were suddenly able to buy and sell goods across continents, completely anonymously. And at the center of it all was Ross Ulbricht, operating under the alias Dread Pirate Roberts. Silk Road functioned much like a conventional online marketplace. Vendors created storefronts. Buyers browsed product listings. Transactions were completed using Bitcoin, which at the time was still a relatively obscure digital currency used mainly by programmers and early adopters. But what made Silk Road truly revolutionary was its combination of anonymity and trust. The website introduced a system of vendor ratings and customer reviews, allowing buyers to evaluate sellers based on reputation. It also used an escrow system, temporarily holding Bitcoin payments until the buyer confirmed that the product had been delivered. In many ways, the platform mirrored legitimate e-commerce sites, except that the marketplace existed entirely within the hidden network of Tor, making it extremely difficult for authorities to trace its users or operators. By 2012, Silk Road had grown into a massive underground economy. Thousands of vendors were offering products ranging from cannabis and psychedelics to prescription drugs and synthetic chemicals. Packages were shipped discreetly through ordinary postal systems, often disguised to avoid detection. Behind the scenes, Ross was managing nearly every aspect of the platform. He spent hours each day responding to messages, updating the site's infrastructure, and mediating disputes between buyers and sellers. Despite the illegal nature of many transactions, Ross saw Silk Road as something different. To him, the marketplace represented a real-world demonstration of the economic principles he admired: voluntary exchange operating outside traditional authority. But as the platform grew, so did its influence. By early 2013, Silk Road had tens of thousands of users and was processing millions of dollars of transactions. Bitcoin, which once traded for just a few dollars, was beginning to gain international attention, partly because of its connection to the dark web marketplace. Silk Road had become the largest anonymous online market the world had ever seen. A digital empire operating beyond borders, beyond banks, and beyond governments. But its rapid rise was also attracting attention from a different kind of audience. Behind the scenes, investigators from multiple government agencies had already begun searching for the man behind the name Dread Pirate Roberts. And slowly, piece by piece, they were beginning to uncover clues. As Silk Road continued to grow, it was no longer just a hidden website buried deep inside the dark web. It had become a global phenomenon. Articles began appearing in major media outlets, describing an anonymous online marketplace where illegal drugs could be purchased with a digital currency few people had even heard of. For law enforcement agencies, Silk Road represented something entirely new. A criminal enterprise that existed almost entirely in cyberspace. Investigating it would require a different kind of approach. Instead of traditional surveillance and undercover operations, investigators had to rely on digital clues, tiny fragments of information scattered across the internet. Soon, multiple agencies joined the investigation. Among them were the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Internal Revenue Service. Each agency brought its own expertise. Some focused on tracing Bitcoin transactions across the blockchain. Others monitored forums and chat rooms where Silk Road users gathered to discuss vendors and products. Digital forensics teams analyzed server logs, forum posts, and fragments of code. For years, the identity of the person behind Silk Road remained a mystery. The administrator, known as Dread Pirate Roberts, appeared careful. He communicated using encrypted channels. He operated entirely through the anonymizing network Tor, and he never revealed his real identity to the community that depended on him. But even the most careful operators can leave traces. In one of the earliest clues, investigators discovered a forum post from 2011 promoting Silk Road. The post had been written by someone seeking help from software developers. Buried inside the message was a contact email address. The name attached to that email was Ross Ulbricht. At first, it seemed like a small lead. But as investigators continued digging, more connections began to emerge. Online accounts, forum activity, coding discussions. Each piece of information brought them one step closer to identifying the person behind the marketplace. Meanwhile, Silk Road continued operating at full scale. Millions of dollars in Bitcoin were flowing through the platform. Thousands of users were placing orders every day. To the outside world, Dread Pirate Roberts remained an anonymous figure, a ghost running one of the largest underground markets in history. But behind the scenes, investigators were getting closer. They had a name. They had a face. Now, they just needed the right moment to prove that Ross Ulbricht and Dread Pirate Roberts were the same person. By 2013, investigators believed they had finally identified the man behind the Silk Road. The evidence had been building for months: digital trails, forum activity, and connections between online accounts that pointed back to one name, Ross Ulbricht. But identifying him wasn't enough. To prove that Ross was the administrator known as Dread Pirate Roberts, investigators needed something far more valuable. They needed access to the Silk Road control panel. And that meant capturing Ross while he was actively logged into the website. There was one problem. Ross was known to use strong encryption on his laptop. If he closed it, Even for a second, the computer could instantly lock, making it nearly impossible for investigators to access the data inside. So agents began planning a very specific type of arrest. They needed Ross distracted, and they needed his laptop open. On October 1st, 2013, Ross Ulbricht walked into the Glen Park Library in San Francisco. He sat down at a table and opened his laptop, just like he had done many times before. From the outside, he looked like any other person working quietly in a public library. But investigators were already inside. Undercover agents were positioned nearby, waiting for the moment when Ross would log into Silk Road. As he typed, the screen in front of him displayed the administrative dashboard of the marketplace, the control panel used by the person known online as Dread Pirate Roberts. Then the plan went into motion. Two agents staged a loud argument nearby, drawing Ross's attention away from the laptop. For a brief moment, he turned his head. That was all the agents needed. In seconds, other investigators rushed forward and grabbed the laptop before it could be closed. Ross was arrested on the spot, and the computer he had been using was still unlocked. On the screen, investigators could see what they had been searching for: the Silk Road administrator panel. Ross Ulbricht was logged in as Dread Pirate Roberts. The digital empire that had operated anonymously for more than 2 years had finally been linked to a real person. News of the arrest spread rapidly across the internet. For many users of Silk Road, it was the first sign that the hidden marketplace might not be as untouchable as they had believed. But the story of Ross Ulbricht and Silk Road was far from over. The arrest was only the beginning of a legal battle that would spark years of debate about cybercrime, digital privacy, and the future of online freedom. Following Ross Ulbricht's arrest in October 2013, the case quickly became one of the most closely watched cybercrime trials in history. Prosecutors argued that Ulbricht had created and operated Silk Road as a massive criminal enterprise. According to the government, the marketplace had enabled the global sale of illegal drugs and facilitated hundreds of millions of dollars in anonymous transactions using Bitcoin. The trial began in early 2015 in a federal court in New York. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented a large collection of digital evidence. Investigators showed chat logs, server data, and files recovered from Ulbricht's laptop at the time of his arrest. The laptop contained administrative tools used to manage Silk Road, as well as communications written under the alias Dread Pirate Roberts. To the prosecution, the conclusion was clear. Ross Ulbricht had built and controlled one of the largest illegal marketplaces ever created on the internet. But the defense presented a different argument. Ulbricht's lawyers suggested that while Ross may have originally created the website, the identity of Dread Pirate Roberts could have been passed between multiple individuals over time. They also argued that Ulbricht had been made an example in an effort to discourage future dark web marketplaces. After several weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Ross Ulbricht was found guilty on multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit drug trafficking, money laundering, and computer hacking. In May 2015, the court sentenced him to 2 life sentences plus 40 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. The sentence sparked years of debate about the severity of the punishment. Supporters organized campaigns calling for clemency. And nearly a decade later, in 2025, Ulbricht's sentence was officially pardoned by Donald Trump, bringing a surprising final chapter to one of the most famous cybercrime cases in internet history. Ross Ulbricht often described Silk Road as an experiment. He believed technology could create a new kind of marketplace, one based on voluntary exchange and individual freedom. Influenced by economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, Ross imagined a digital economy operating beyond traditional institutions. But ideas that seem logical in theory can produce very different outcomes in reality. Silk Road did not remain a philosophical experiment. It became a global marketplace for illegal trade, attracting thousands of users and millions of dollars in transactions through Bitcoin and hidden services on Tor. What began as a project built on ideological beliefs eventually crossed into serious criminal activity, and the consequences were real. Ross Ulbricht was arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. His story is not simply about technology, freedom, or innovation. It is a reminder that powerful tools, whether economic theories, anonymous networks, or digital currencies, carry responsibilities. Intentions alone do not determine outcomes. Actions do. And when those actions affect thousands of people across the world, the consequences can be permanent. The story of Silk Road is often told as the rise and fall of a dark web empire. But the real lesson is much simpler. Ideas can change the world. But without responsibility and accountability, those same ideas can also destroy lives, including the life of the person who created them.